I am Mary Lou Welby, the hydrologist for the Magone Project. I will be presenting the Watershed Resource Story. The Watershed Resource Story is a work in progress. We're still processing field data, updating our maps. The watershed processes in the Magone Project area are complex. I will be presenting a fair amount of information, but hopefully it will be organized to present a clear story. I invite you to pause this presentation periodically, maybe back up and look at a map, and pause again as needed. Now, let's get on with the watershed story in the Magone Project area. We'll take a quick look at the project area. There are two sub-watersheds, East Fork Beach Creek to the west or the right, and a smaller one, Grub Creek, to the left or east. As you can see, there are several named streams in East Fork Beach Creek and really only one main stream in Grub Creek that is named. There are numerous tributaries and ephemeral draws. The ephemeral draws are not shown yet. Where does the watershed story begin? With the Organic Act of 1897, which established the forest reserves, the predecessors to the National Forest System. This act provides for favorable flows of water in timing, in quantity, and in quality. So how does the watershed resource story continues with water in the dry Magone landscape. It continues from 1897 through the decades to the present. And I like to use a quote from John Buckhouse, a retired Oregon State University professor of range science, to talk about water in the dry landscapes of eastern Oregon. Water is important over here because it's scarce. It's important to capture, store, and safely release. I think this quote is a straightforward summary for a complex web of watershed processes. More details later. So continuing to talk about water in the dry landscape, we're going to take a closer look at what safely release means in this landscape. It means erosion prevention, hill slope and channel, controlling overland flow, encouraging infiltration, providing late season flows, which are often cooler when sufficient water is available, and it has to do with growing vegetation sustainably. Now, as we continue with the watershed resource story, we'll pause for a moment and look at how this presentation is organized. So there are 5 sections in the presentation: the introduction, which we just completed with the review of the Organic Act of 1897 and John Buckhouse's quote about water, capturing, storing it, and safely releasing it. We'll go on to have an overview of watershed function in the Magone Project area, then a detour to water and vegetation, including forests, shrublands, grasslands, and crusts. Cryptogamic crusts are plant communities of lichens and mosses that act as the glue in very shallow soils or very stony soils to hold the soils together. They aid tremendously in infiltration. And then we'll look at water and watershed function in the Magone landscape with a closer look, and then an even closer look, and we'll look at roads, and finally we'll have a conclusion. This is a simplified overview of a complex web of processes. So looking at the overview of watershed function in the Magone area, I want to remind everyone that this is a dynamic story. We use verbs, not nouns. It's a story primarily of ever-changing processes and functions, and to a lesser extent of conditions or alternatively, it's a story of conditions interacting as a set of ecosystem processes and functions. Either way, it's dynamic. We use words like stream flow, gravity, Buckhouse's verbs, capture, store, release. Continuing with background information, first item I want to talk about is abundance. Water is not abundant in the Magone area. And even though water is not abundant, the storage capacity is limited. That relates back to the soils, the subsoils, and the bedrock, and the fact that the water does not move easily between those three zones. What this means is that water is the limiting growth factor for vegetation. Finally, there is a legal and regulatory framework that governs how we address water in the Magone landscape. As I mentioned, the Organic Act of 1897, the Clean Water Act with fish as a beneficial use for water quality, and then the Endangered Species Act, the John Day Basin Plan address fish habitat needs. So as I said, water is not abundant and it moves with difficulty through the soil, subsoil, and bedrock. This map, which is based on the Natural Resource Conservation Services, hydrological groups, and their soil surveys, indicates how much of the area water moves with difficulty. The take-home lesson is that the more the reds, oranges, and browns indicate flashier conditions, but the subsoils under the green and bluish polygons are also flashy, and water moves with difficulty through those. So why are we looking at water, and why here? Water naturally drains off fast. Runoff is accelerated by activities or their legacies implemented since European settlement. We'll talk about that more later. We have altered watershed processes as a result. Acceleration is primed. This acceleration is primed to continue or possibly increase in the near to midterm decades unless altered processes are interrupted and reset. We'll get into more details in the closer look. Now we're going to detour briefly to vegetation. So in water and vegetation, we'll take a look at trees, shrubs, grass and forbs, and cryptogamic crusts. For trees and shrubs, water is the limiting growth factor. We get an increase in tree stem density due to fire exclusion, so that means we have generally slower growing trees and fuels accumulation. All of this is covered in silviculture in the topic stand dynamics. It's also demonstrated by the shorter trees where they are encroaching on poorer sites, e.g. less water is available, and there are similar concerns on dry shrublands. Now this slide was left intentionally blank. If you've seen the silviculture fuels presentation, remember the pictures of forest stands with dense ingrowth of young trees. Otherwise, go see the silviculture and fuels presentations. Continuing to talk about water and vegetation, we'll look at dry shrubs, grass and forbs, and cryptogamic crusts. So the shifts in species composition within these groups are consistent with a decrease in infiltration, soil loss, litter reduction, loss of cryptogamic crusts, an increase in overland flow, and overland flow contributes to adverse changes in stream flow timing and quantity and may result in erosion on hill slopes or in channels. See the range and botany presentations for some more details about the plant communities. Where juniper has increased, the availability of soil water to other species is generally reduced. This is the end of the vegetation section. Now back to water in the Magone landscape and a close look at it. Water, as I said before, water drains fast naturally due to the soils and faster due to human activities and legacy. Briefly, we'll look at the stream map again. Just another note that the ephemeral draws are not showing up. We haven't added them to the map yet. They would be represented by very thin lines, probably between 50 and 100 of them. We have been surveying them in the field. So what? Why are we taking this closer look at water? Well, fish are like the canary in the mine. How is this? Fish are telling us that something is not working on the landscape. Maybe it's the water. So now if we consider water on the Magone landscape, what have we observed? So there are three key observations. Water arrives in the project area, which is kind of like buckhouses capturing the water. Local conditions and legacies affect how water moves through the landscape. That can be equated with buckhouses storing water. And then we have altered processes and conditions that are observed today, and this relates to the final step of how the water is released. It said water arrives in the project area either as in the subsurface as groundwater or as precipitation onto the soil surface as snow, which then goes through snow melt process in the spring, which can occasionally be rapid, especially when we have the warm spring Chinook winds, or rain on snow. We also have rain, most commonly as either intense convective summer thunderstorms or as sustained fall or spring, sometimes even summer rains. All these sources of precipitation arrive with the potential to run off and or erode. And they affect the quantity, timing, and quality of water. In this case, water quality is related to temperature, not to other pollutants. So what? The local conditions and legacies affect water in motion once it arrives. There's more overland flow, as we've said, due to local geology, less runoff infiltrates. There's more overland flow due to reduced ground cover and legacy disturbance. Some areas are not recovered. Stream flows are higher and earlier due to lack of water storage in stream channels and draws. And there's several effects there listed in smaller print. You can read as you have time. So the conclusion for this section is that energy during runoff and high flows is elevated. Water is not being safely released. As I said, we have altered processes and conditions, eroded and eroding simplified channels. And again, we have various impacts of that, such as reduced floodplains, no undercut banks, reduced riparian communities. The water leaves the landscape more quickly, which gives us reduced late season flows, and warmer water temperatures, which are also influenced by the lack of shade resulting from altered riparian communities. Okay, so given the existing water quality and watershed function processes and conditions, we see that they are not sufficient to provide favorable flows of water, timing, quantity, and quality as required under the Organic Act of 1897, and they are not sufficient to provide adequate habitat for an ESA-listed fish species, also a beneficial use under the Clean Water Act. The illustrations will come in a later section. I want to start from ridgetop to stream flow and the water quality of the stream flow. We're taking a even closer look at hillslope, ephemeral draw, and stream conditions. And we'll do this in two approaches. We'll begin, the first one will be generally by topographic position, since gravity causes water to flow downhill. You can see the topographic positions on the left, and then how the water flows through them results in the amount of stream flow and the quality of the water. And then I will go into some individual stream descriptions, examples that integrate various conditions and altered processes, again from the ridgetop to stream flow and water quality for those selected streams. So once again, reviewing the map of streams and subwatersheds, you can, the hill slope starts near that turquoisey blue line that forms the boundary of the watershed, or the watershed divide. You can see that the Grub Creek subwatershed is separated from the East Fork Beech Creek by the divide along the turquoise line, about 1/4 of the way to the west from the right-hand side of the picture. The streams are named, except for East Fork of Beech Creek, which flows along the southern part of the project area in the East Fork Beech Creek subwatershed just above the forest boundary. So the hillslope conditions range from functional to poorly functioning. Forested areas are generally infiltrating well, except in the drainage network itself, starting with ephemeral draws and some of the intermittent streams. The non-forested areas have shifted to providing more overland flow as a result of historic grazing practices and shifts in plant species. Some of those are located near the top of Clear Creek, on the east of McClellan Creek, that ridge, which is actually recovering as bunch grass fills in the spaces, and areas that are scattered along East Fork of Beech Creek, and numerous small tribs from the top of the trib down to where they flow into East Fork. Individually, these areas are not of high concern, but their location near and connection to the drainage network and their sheer number increases the hazard. So here's an example of pedestal grassland. You can see that the tannish soil layer is an inch or two below the clumps of grass. This promotes overland flow and reduced infiltration. So if we go to the streams and draws that connect the hill slopes to down to the stream channels, especially in the headwaters, we find those are also functional to poorly functioning. There's some functioning ones, areas listed along Lake and Tinker Creeks in McClellan, poorly functioning along Clear Creek, the 663 road tributary, East Fork, Beech Creek, Grub Creek. So here's an example of erosion in one of the upper reaches to Clear Creek. Summary of the conditions in the headwaters is that there's altered functionality where they're disturbed. Water runs off too fast and too early. Eroded channels concentrate flow and result in downstream erosion. There's loss of riparian vegetation locally and downstream. So flowing on downstream, we get to eroded and eroding channels. One of our seasonals, Owen Haskell, started describing these as cobble, cobble, cobble channels. Again, I list 3 locations. There are others. You can read this at your leisure. Here's a picture of a cobble, cobble, cobble stream. You can see the large material and also the fact that the stream is eroded out on either side. We have valley floor erosion, which results in the loss of floodplain sediment and the associated water storage in those soils. There's a shift in vegetation from riparian to weedy species, or a loss of vegetation. And again, I list several locations. One of the questions about these, where you have this kind of erosion or dished out channels, is how do you develop undercut banks when no banks are present? And we know from reading the range records that Lower McClellan Creek was a sacrifice zone, as noted in 1919 or thereabouts. Here's a picture of valley floor erosion. You can see it's wide, and much of the valley floor is eroded, the channel hasn't just deepened. Floodplain connectivity is also important to consider. The streams listed previously are disconnected from their floodplains, and more are also affected. Again, I show some characteristics that are changed. the results are that energy is transferred downstream, downstream channels erode, we get dished out channels, no undercut banks, and we get warmer stream temperatures. And again, here's the stream and road map. We will, the next few slides will list some of the streams and give a summary of the conditions along those streams. Again, these are selected streams for examples. So Clear Creek, which flows above the roadless area, through it, and then out of it, has altered grasslands up high, roads redirecting overland flow both above it and within the roadless area. We have crossings, eroded headwater and other channels, some relic skid trails, and there was likely a debris torrent that went through the Nipple Butte roadless area beginning north of it or above it on the slope. Similarly, East Fork of Beech Creek has a number of altered processes. Both of these streams do have isolated large wood that is still functional. So here's a sequence of what's going on at Clear Creek up near the top. It looks relatively small, but when you consider there are multiple streams or draws that have eroded and are contributing flow, you can see that there is a concentration. So this location is below a non-forested dry grassland that's altered, has lost its cryptogamic crust, so is producing a lot of overland flow. And then about 300 yards downstream, you can see that there's a little bit of a gully eroding. And finally, about a tenth of a mile downstream, you can see that there is definitely a wider channel eroding, much rockier, beginning to get cobbly, especially when you look over there on in the upper right corner. There's more about this in the fisheries presentation. So continuing with examples of streams, as I've mentioned, there's the Road 663 tributary. I'll show some pictures of very early recovery along that stream in a moment. McClellan Creek is over-widened at the lower level, in the lower segment where it was made a sacrifice zone. There is substantial bunchgrass recovery up near the ridge tops, and there's functional wood and riparian areas in the upper reaches and upper tributaries. So here's an early stage of recovery in one of the tribs to East Fork of Beech Creek. You can see the piece of wood there that has caught sediment and allowed grasses and sedges to recolonize. And if you look in the upper right corner, you can see a little slightly more eroded channel below the wood. Another early stage of recovery, they actually have some standing water persisting into late summer. We do have some special cases out in the Magone Project area as far as hydrology is concerned. We have Magone Lake and a number of springs and seeps. Magone Lake was formed by a landslide about 1840. It is continuing to adjust to coarse woody inputs from that point and since, and other factors related to its formation. It's a special case, possibly unique in the Pacific Northwest due to its young age. And as I said, there are a number of springs and seeps. We're coordinating with range and wildlife surveys on that. So summary, preliminary conclusion number one is we have altered watershed processes, functions, conditions affecting water quality and availability, and fish habitat, which are governed under those regulatory acts listed. Too much water leaves the landscape too fast. I'm going to take a quick look at roads over the entire project area. They're both direct and indirect influences. As I said, direct influences are when the road itself is capturing the precipitation, routing the water down it, and at places like stream crossings. We also have indirect influences from roads, where they capture and redirect overland flow from other sources. This was occurring at 18 of 100 road points checked. Roads intercept subsurface flows and redirect them. They constrain valley widths. We can get plugged culverts, which increase hazards. There's at least partial plugging at 30 of 100 road points checked. roads increase connectivity of landscape and thus increase risk and hazard generally if drainage is not designed well and maintained. So here's a picture of a road redirecting overland flow. Just out of the picture to the right are a series of gullies, roughly 12 inches to 18 inches wide and 6 to 8 inches deep, that connect down to one of the trips to East Fork of Beech Creek. We have other gullies in the Magone area, often associated with culverts and, as I said, with the tributary in the previous, near the road in the previous picture. Gullies accelerate the overland flow leaving the project area. Here's a picture of a gully initiation about 150 feet below a culvert, and about 0.15 of a mile below the culvert you can see that it's become a dished out channel, still considered a gully. So the conclusion number 2 is that roads exacerbate natural processes which were already exacerbated by other activities, especially activities implemented before the application of watershed best management practices. Too much water leaves the landscape too fast. So at the landscape scale, there's something of a quandary. Magone is one small part of the landscape, but not unique. Conditions and altered processes are pervasive, death by 1,000 cuts. The future, Band-Aids can be effective on small cuts, and for low cost, we can apply inexpensive practices like Band-Aids innovatively to promote desired conditions over time, and we can apply more complex practices where stream energies are high. So the conclusion to the Watershed Story is to remember John Buckhouse's quote, "Water, capture, store, and safely release it," and consider converting areas with altered watershed processes into ones supporting water quality and fish habitat that meet or exceed standards. And a bonus to doing this is we will probably realize more flexible management options in the long term.